what we used to always say, which was trust but verify, and move from that model to never trust and always verify.
Good afternoon. My name is Gregory Turk with MindPoint Group. I am a virtual CISO as well as a program manager for critical infrastructure in the public sector. I'm joined today by Tom Bakry, also with MindPoint Group, and I'll have Tom introduce himself.
Yeah, hi. It's great to see you, Turk. I'm as Turk said, I'm with MindPoint Group. I am the leader of the MPGSOC service that we offer. And I'm excited to be here to talk with Turk once again. We love to break down different topics in the InfoSec space. And today we'll be talking about zero trust, something that's very near and dear to my heart.
Speaking of zero trust, Tom, we can agree, I think, that whether it's a buzzword or it's a conceptual approach or it's a marketing term, it's something that we have to come to terms with. And it, from a conceptual perspective, it does make a lot of sense in terms of how we approach cybersecurity in the most recent threat landscape. Do you have any comments to either back that up or refute?
Yes, our industry is rife with buzzwords, and this is really no different. And it's really important, I think, to understand where it's coming from. So zero trust apparently is a term that was coined by an analyst at Forrester back in 2010. And the idea is to get beyond what we used to always say, which was trust but verify, and move from that model to never trust and always verify. And there's no question in my mind, but information security, that's critical.
And as that pertains to an organization or an enterprise, there is the idea that it's almost like you assume that there's a compromise and that all entities are not trusted until the posture of that device or person or application is a trusted resource. And within MindPoint, if you look at the zero trust principles, components, elements, or pillars, as they tend to change, there is the necessity for visibility and analytics somewhere in that stack. It doesn't really matter where you start, whether you start with identity or network or its apps and workloads. One of the more important things is, first of all, it's a data-centric approach. Having taken the recent Forrester certification for zero trust, it did move from the pillar approach that CISA puts forward as, this is you're mature if you can get to this point, if you can point out that your data is protected, that your networks are protected, that your apps are protected. But the Forrester certification leans to a more of a data-centric approach with concentric circles around it that really focus on building the foundational components and having the tools, but having visibility and analytics across the stack. And of course, automation and orchestration over time as you mature from that initial stage to something that's more advanced. And in the rare cases that someone is going to or has reached the optimal stage, you certainly has visibility across the stack. And so that's saying a lot, but the question I'd like to pose to you is, if we're looking at providing visibility and analytics across that stack, as a past, VP of technology at cyber sports organization, one of the first things that I relied on when I was trying to have more visibility into my enterprise was beginning with a SOC-as-a-service. And I kind of wanted to see if you could talk a little bit to that component or that particular tool as it pertains to zero trust.
Well, SOC-as-a-service, I think is something that lots and lots of organizations really need to consider as a way of rapidly elevating their maturity from a security perspective. It's it's no small feat to build out a 24/7 security operations function within your organization. And when an organization decides that that's a next step for them in terms of their maturity, they really need to know whether or not they are properly resourced to be able to make that journey. And frankly, if they're at the beginning of that process, I think it's a perfectly legitimate strategy is not necessarily to start from zero, but to start with a level of maturity that a security operations as a service can bring to you, and then continue to work to build your own function in-house if that's ultimately the desire for the organization. But literally, if you're starting from nothing, it just doesn't make any sense not to get that rapid jump to maturity, because frankly, we all know what it means to get owned, and we don't want to be owned, right? With respect, though, to zero trust, when I think about zero trust, I largely think about it as a secure access service edge, as a mechanism that we can use in our organizations to provide us with, I'll call it VPN 2.0. So we know the value that VPNs have brought us in terms of being able to access what's important to our businesses securely. And with Secure Access Service Edge, it kind of takes that functionality and gives it a bit of a boost. It's no longer as brittle. It's oftentimes and typically an optimized route to the things that we really care about. Like for example, if we're a Microsoft shop, we really care about getting to the Microsoft network, and being able to get that optimized path, that secure path through our tool is a real win for us. So, I think that's one of the things that really comes to mind for me when I look at zero trust as a solution is that it's bringing the ability for me to have visibility down to the endpoint, no matter where they are, and to know that endpoint is securely connecting into the resources that they need to do their jobs. And as far as us as a managed security operations center, when we get that kind of visibility, we're able to do a lot more than we are if you're just running over a VPN, because you're not really part of that network.
Yeah, to that end, Tom, if I'm thinking about, and actually I'm going to take it back to a conversation we've had previously, where you have, you've got all these issues in your network, requirements or compliance needs. You have to figure out somewhere to start. And when you have multiple requirements, pitted against you, maybe not enough resources, the starting point can be obscured for you. And ultimately, if you think about cybersecurity as a whole, we talked about the idea of there being a fear sort of approach or response, and we adopt a bunch of different tools. But in terms of where do you start first if you're going to start down your zero trust journey, and if you've heard in the past, I need to start with identity management, or I have to start with protecting my data. That's kind of a bigger focus in public sector right now, based on data loss prevention and the fear of and scare of non-beneficial artificial intelligence, sending our data out into the public sphere. So the question that kind of like always comes to mind is, if I am a new CISO or I am a new CIO, and I have all of these sort of obstacles in front of me, and one of them is they tell me I have to start zero trust in my network, or at least start observing some of the tenets of zero trust. Where do I start if I want to bring down the noise, if I want to be able to focus on what's most important, what's going to give me visibility into the incidents and what I should be doing in terms of, all of these alerts come in, where do I focus? And so I'm looking kind of specifically, and maybe it's SOC-as-a-service, maybe it's something else, but what in your mind is important for providing that visibility?
So that's a tough one to unpack. You've got a lot there. We have some things that I would consider to be foundational that are absolutely critical to deal with, and everybody's problem is a little bit different because not everybody's in the same place at the time when they start looking. So, I think one of the things that's really important to the question is, are you a traditional, legacy sort of an environment, a brick and mortar, if you will, where you've got a physical presence where people go to work, and then you've got things like a network to protect, maybe a data center to protect, or are you really cloud first sort of an organization? I think those items are pretty important to establishing where you probably are in the process. So let's talk about the organization that's a physical presence first, right? With an organization's physical presence, they're going to have those concerns about making sure that they have physical security controls in place. They're going to be concerned about protecting for devices that are not authorized to be operating in their environment. And so they've got network security concerns that organizations that are maybe cloud centric or cloud first may not have to the same degree. Organizations who are now, earlier I was talking about Secure Access Service Edge. Just as a clarification there, the Secure Access Service Edge is built on the principles of Zero Trust. It is not necessarily the same. I would say, if anything, it's a component of a Zero Trust strategy for an organization. So if you're an organization who's cloud first, you want to look at how are we getting our people to the things that they need to work with. And from that perspective, we're not necessarily as concerned about protecting their network as we are just securely connecting them into the clouds that we work with.
So in my experience, that does ring true, Tom. If I think about, someone who has more of a brick and mortar, who has a larger on-premise sort of presence, infrastructure, it's going to be a completely different approach. If I think back to my time with a sports organization, I had both on-premise in the middle of, not the middle of, the start of the pandemic. So we quickly had to change our approach from, something that was more like the moat and bridge sort of look and feel, to something where it was a more distributed workforce. So we had to expand it. So the network expanded to each home. And if you imagine those security concerns when you pull away from your regular enterprise, expand exponentially. And I think at the time, Zero Trust wasn't really something that was being kicked around, but we still understand the idea of least privilege. And that's really where we're going with Zero Trust. And I believe, based on our current offerings at MindPoint, where if you look at it from the partners that we've chosen, the Sumo Logics, the CrowdStrikes, the soon to be managed Zscalers, we're putting ourselves in play with larger trusted platforms, almost to the point where you could say it's Zero Trust as a platform, if I were the marketer. And that just means to me, the components are there for us to not only provide, coverage for networks, coverage for your visibility and analytics, ultimately, automation and orchestration. Once you have identified all your data sources, identified all your critical assets, there is the ability for you then to see further into your network, tune down the noise, and make sense of what is otherwise a really tough puzzle, especially for someone coming to an enterprise and trying to figure out things from the beginning. I don't know if you have any response to that.
I like what you had said earlier, and I'm not going to repeat it. But I'll try and paraphrase a little bit. That the whole notion that we don't just trust you, that we don't just trust your device, that we need to have that zero trust is. Let's not talk about zero trust as if it's a technology, but let's really talk more about zero trust as if it's essentially a philosophy of how we're going to be acting as security practitioners, how we're going to be securing our organizations. We're going to insist that you prove you are who you say you are, and we're only going to adhere to the most critical components and tenets of information security, where we give you just what you need to get your job done, no more, no less. When we look at traditional networking and security, we've come a long way. We were back in the day, we were happy just to get them talking, and a network engineer or a system administrator who was deploying some technology in the environment would struggle, and they'd do things like throw the doors wide open just to get it to work. And then they'd walk away declaring victory and leave the doors wide open. And so many organizations have paid the price from that approach to technology. And that's, I think, a big piece of what organizations need to be thinking about as they're maturing their practices. How do we get away from the idea that we just need to make it work and we're done? How do we make sure that security is involved with our initiatives, our technology initiatives from the very first, and that security goes hand in glove throughout those initiatives? I mean, really, to me, it's an organizational mind shift that needs to get away from just, oh my gosh, I got to get this working, and oh, thank goodness I got it working, and I'm done.
I completely agree, and I think that if you take a step back as a CISO or a CIO, you'll see that traditionally, assuming the tool set you have in your infrastructure, if not tuned and configured and continuously monitored over time and continually improved, ultimately you find yourself in a hole. That said, I want to switch the focus a little bit and talk about compliance, because that's a lot of the work that we do at MPG. And I want to talk specifically because, actually I want to talk more generally and then focus on maybe a standard that you want to speak to.
Calling for a reason, because you're playing into my hands. This is exactly what I'm going to talk about.
All right, well, good. I'm happy I finally got there. So where I sit specifically, Tom, in the public sector is in the legislative branch. So they don't necessarily have to answer to any executive orders. So the OMB directive that says zero trust is more of a, you should go this route because your friends on the Hill are doing that. But there are areas where we work elsewhere in MindPoint where it's very specific. You have to adhere to CMMC 2.0 at some point in the near future. There are areas that are less stringent, which, they're looking at CIS 18 as a more kind of like easy to read and understand approach. And then, of course, there is the NIST 800.171, where the controls are very specific. And to walk the compliance tightrope, you have to be very explicit in how you detail that you have these controls in place, and you're able to maintain those over time. So with that said, just opening it up, Let's talk a little bit about compliance.
You know, the reason why I'm so jazzed about talking about this is because it really cuts to the core of what I was just talking about, where we as an organization desiring to improve our security posture and to maintain it, um, we can't just set and forget that the notion that it's okay to just stand up the technology in our environment and we're done, and now we just have to do moves, adds, changes, and deletes is dead. That's gone. People have people out there actually make quite a good living doing things like hacking us, and you cannot hope to stand against the storm of things that are coming at you if you aren't continually keeping your environment up. So governance, and good governance and risk management and complying with standards that you adopt are your friend. They help you to stay on top of your environment. They do things like they tell you, hey, don't just set that and forget it. You have to go back every so often and look at it again and decide if it still holds true. But they aren't necessarily prescriptive. The rules that you choose to adopt, but what they are is an opportunity for you to document the decision that you've made and to test whether or not you're following that decision. And doing those, taking that step in maturity, for a lot of commercial concerns is considered highly optional. For government and highly regulated industries, it isn't optional, and that's to their benefit. I would pose that organizations that consider compliance frameworks to be an option, that it really shouldn't be an option for you. It should be your friend. It should be your ally in increasing and maintaining your cyber maturity.
In terms of how MindPoint could come in and help with that sort of approach, if you think about our SOC-as-a-service, we've said in the past, all SOC-as-a-service not built the same. The way that you approach a problem, the way that you are able to onboard, way you're able to bring a customer along that journey of initial stages, and get to the point where they're more mature is a longer process, and one that has to be maintained. And somewhere in there is like this continual improvement process that comes along with being led down a path. And MPGSOC for me, if I look at where I was when I first pulled in SOC as a service and was starting to understand the nuances of what's good, what's bad, I was first relieved, and then and we're not talking about MPGSOC, we're talking about before I became aware of MPGSOC, other competitors out there before I came into MindPoint. But I realized that if it's not continually improved, what you have is just another bunch of alerts to look at, another area of concern, if not well managed and not well communicated back to at the time me as a customer. I'm kind of like leading us down the path of, as a MPG client, our SOC as a service differentiates itself based on, in my mind, a lot of what is a beauty of how we present is our ability to communicate, where the gaps are, and to review and let the customer know where they can improve. And just wanted to have you speak to that a little bit.
Sure. So, from my perspective, it's our remit as your security operations center to be continually trying to advance the state of your cyber maturity, and to improve and enhance your security posture. We plan from the very beginning, when we're onboarding a customer, we're learning about that customer's environment, and we're developing documentation that helps our analysts understand the environment so that we can tell the difference between what's normal and expected and what isn't. As we go along throughout the course of the service with your company, we're continually reviewing the decisions that we make, and the results that we're getting, and looking to maintain a dialogue where you're able to tell us about what's changing in your environment, because frankly, you're not cast in stone. You're developing your organization, you're building your business, you're adopting new technologies, deploying new systems, opening new lines of business, expanding your business. All those sort of things change your attack surface. And it's important that your security operations team is in the loop and is aware and is making sure that you aren't developing blind spots. And along the way, you've mentioned this a couple of times, we need to tame the noise. We don't get all of those answers on day one when we're doing our discovery with you during your onboarding. We learn, and we continually learn from your organization. And hopefully we also help your organization to learn about some of the things that you might not otherwise see along the way.
So Tom, I can say again, I've enjoyed this conversation, and the first time we did this, we were less acquainted. We've had the ability to work on some accounts together now, so I know the value of the things that you say, and I appreciate in my actual day-to-day workings with clients what that means for us presenting a product that's useful to the client, and it makes my job a lot easier just to show up on those calls and be like, yeah, Tom's got this. So in that vCISO role, I very much appreciate you. There's some other spaces where I'll look for your help in the future. And I did just want to bring us back to a point that we've talked about previously as well. Whether the audience is starting their zero trust journey, whether zero trust is even something that's on their radar, it's based on so the big names in the industry, the Gartners and the Forresters of the world. There will be a large swing towards that approach, and in that, don't leave fear out of it. There is a very real likelihood that you will be compromised. We said previously, it's not a matter of if, it's just a when. And understanding that should take the fear out of it. And we move from the idea of cybersecurity and making sure we have this very secure posture and nothing can happen to us, to like, well, we just kind of need to be better about our cyber resilience and knowing that we can bounce back after the fact, and observing some of these zero trust principles, components, looking at the pillars, understanding how they interconnect and work together, are just some of the foundational elements, and we can help you get there. With that, Tom, I'm just going to let you close it out with any additional commentary, anything you have to say. Doesn't have to be along the lines of zero trust. Speak from your heart.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. I absolutely agree. I enjoy our conversations, and I appreciate you. Where zero trust is something that everybody needs to be paying attention to. Again, it's not like a particular product. It's really got to be more of a philosophy for your organization to adopt. You want to be looking for solutions that are properly securing your organization and ensuring that you know who it is that's coming in, and you keep the people who aren't supposed to come in from coming in. All that said, I think it's really important that we know what's important to you, the audience. So please subscribe, and make comments and tell us what's interesting and important to you.
Thanks, Tom. And thank you to the audience. We look forward to seeing you soon. And we'll see you next time.